I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. Well, politics have been in the news a lot lately, as they have been for the last couple of years, and today we're following up kind of about a year ago when we had a chance to visit with Missouri Southern's political science professors and get a feel for what's happening nationally, locally, statewide, internationally, and I'd like to welcome them for rejoining me today on the program.
Thank you
very much for being here today.
You.
As I mentioned, about a year ago we gathered. It was pre-election time. People are, what's going to happen in the election? What are your thoughts? Now that you've had this almost a year to reflect on what happened and where we're at, what are your reactions, perhaps in each of your areas?
Well, in my area, in the case of American politics, Trump kind of was initially a big enigma for political scientists, and the idea of trying to figure out why he won. And then, kind of after the election, had some time to kind of figure out, I think the issues upon which he ran and how he was able to, I think in some ways, pull voters away from, kind of national Democrats, particularly in the upper Midwest. The issue, I think, for me is kind of figuring out the effect of Donald Trump's election in 2016 for the upcoming midterm elections in 2018. Okay. There seems to be a lot of conflict within maybe the Republican Party, so the question is how that will affect congressional elections.
So there's always that after, okay, you've got what you want,
right.
Now what's going to happen next?
Exactly.
Tying that together.
Exactly.
Well, as we move a little closer to home, what are your feelings maybe statewide here in Missouri after elections?
It's interesting because at the state level, we also have Republicans in control of both houses of the state legislature and the governor's mansion. And kind of like at the national level, that hasn't been the key to mass numbers of legislation getting passed. The state legislature certainly was productive in their spring session, plus they had 2 special sessions this summer, which hasn't happened in about 20 years. But even though all of this is occurring and they have control over everything, they haven't accomplished many of their primary objectives. And there's a lot of internal disagreement among Republicans, both at the national level and here in Missouri.
So it's hard to get that unity now that we have it. What are we going to do? How are we going to accomplish what we talked about? And of course, international ramifications of, and especially what happened here in the United States election.
Yeah, a lot of things are going on in international relations. The Trump administration is dealing with nuclear proliferation again. And sort of this age of nuclear deterrence is starting to come back, and we have this sort of game of chicken that's being played with North Korea, but also trying to manage Iran and the civil war in Syria, while also trying to co-opt China into these agreements. And so the Trump administration is, trying to navigate these things, and so far it's taken a pretty hardline stance, which hasn't always worked with Kim Jong-un, but then again, neither has negotiation. So he's in kind of a tough spot there.
So as I said, there's a lot of, you could pick up a newspaper or turn on the news or look online any day. A lot of these things are making headlines. And
constantly. Well, and domestically, here, you've got all of these issues kind of coming out kind of seemingly every day. You've got tax reform, you've got repeal and potentially replace the Affordable Care Act, you've got immigration. It seems like, not to suggest that they wouldn't be prominent in other contexts, but it seems like there's a lot of difficult issues that the Trump administration is trying to address kind of simultaneously, as opposed to kind of doing so.
We'll take care of this, move on to the next
exactly,
one. Right.
Which makes it harder for them.
So they're almost kind of juggling things in some instances.
Yes. Well, and you mentioned kind of unified control. You have a president and you have, at least the national level, control by the same party in Congress. Right. We would assume maybe more productivity, but we really haven't seen that yet. So it'll be interesting to see how they address all these issues, hopefully, by the end of the 2018.
So a year from now we'll be in another election cycle, as you mentioned. So how are these things going to affect what's happening a year from now? So let's talk about some of the updates people have heard. You mentioned North Korea, making headlines. The president speaking at the United Nations. We're tough. We're going to do things. What do you feel? How the world is receiving this type of message?
I think the world. The United Nations would rather see more of a diplomatic tone mixed in with this. The thing about this is we have to grapple with the reality that North Korea absolutely has mobile nuclear weapons with intercontinental ballistic missiles. They may actually have submarine capable intercontinental ballistic missiles. They've moved from liquid fuel to solid fuel, which means they can launch them in a quicker time frame. And I don't think that they're without second strike capability. And so you're in a nuclear deterrent game, and that sort of sometimes takes the sort of traditional warfare off the table. And so in this type of situation, you really need to work with both negotiation and hardline stances. And one of the biggest worries here is if you make hardline stances and the other side makes hardline stances and you continue to escalate your threat, countries can make mistakes and bluffs can be called. And in those situations, you could escalate the world into a much more tense position than we are now.
I mentioned, China and Russia playing a picture internationally, the United States' relations with those countries.
Yeah, I mean, right now, President Trump has, during the campaign, talked about trade, right? Mm-hmm. And he tends to be less of a free trade advocate than previous presidents. Although surprisingly, NAFTA negotiations are on hold, and some of the World Trade Organization negotiations with China are on hold. And I actually expected the Trump administration to leverage free trade with China to help him negotiate in the North Korea situation, and that doesn't seem to be coming to fruition either. But yeah, these things are on the table. He's working on them.
So it's just for some people that wish you work a little faster in getting some things done along those lines. You mentioned in the state of Missouri having the Republicans in the legislature and the state leadership, not only the governor, but the other state elected officers. We have a lot of Republicans and the lieutenant governor, a lot of them across the line.
Absolutely. It's been pretty normal in Missouri the last 25 years to have Republicans control the majority, but to have some Democrats mixed in statewide offices, particularly in things like the auditor position, the treasurer position, which are not necessarily ideologically based in the job duties. But yeah, they have unified control. Although some of these other positions, having a lieutenant governor be a Republican is not that useful. The lieutenant governor has a list of duties specific, unlike the vice president who just needs a heartbeat. The lieutenant governor actually sits on a number of boards and commissions for the state. But it's not directly involved in policy making on a day-to-day basis. If the governor can work with the leadership in the state house and state senate, they'll be much more productive. But they're still fighting about the prescription drug monitoring program that the governor decided to start without any appropriations from the legislature, and the legislature's very upset that there are new metal detectors at the doors of the Capitol. The legislators did not want that, did not appropriate money for it. The governor had them installed anyway.
So it's kind of executive order from the governor.
Yeah, and so the governor is moving money from different places in the appropriations bill to cover these projects that the legislature opposes. And so they're not seeing eye to eye on a number of things. That's getting in the way of their other policy priorities, I think.
Budget's always a big challenge for the state and national as well. But looking at the state of Missouri, of course, higher education, we're affected by those budget changes. All different branches of state government are being affected by those challenges. So they have a lot of juggling to do with that.
Yeah, and it's not going to end anytime soon. There's a new report out that the Missouri Public Workers retirement program is $4 billion behind where it needs to be, with no plan to make it up because of over-optimistic expectations for return on investments. They're looking at Medicaid expenses are continuing to rise. And under the federal guidelines, there's only so many more people we can kick off Medicaid here in Missouri before violating the conditions of the federal grant. And so these costs continue to rise, and so we're going to have to reconsider what to do.
Now, in Missouri, we've heard a lot about want to bring jobs in, bring jobs. Have you seen any sense with the legislature or the governor trying to do that job development statewide?
Yeah, there's been some effort. It's actually quite difficult for a government to encourage jobs. They can offer tax breaks to companies, which sometimes can be helpful. Tax breaks do not always lead to job growth, and they certainly don't lead to predictable job growth. And so it's a fine thing to try, but it doesn't always work. One of the special sessions that the governor called this summer was to discuss utility tax breaks for some companies to lure them to the boot hill of Missouri to increase job growth. Things like that, sometimes it can be helpful, but sometimes you end up giving up more in tax revenue from these companies than you get back in income taxes.
So that's your bottom line in the long run and what money's coming into the state.
Yeah, and it's admittedly a very difficult thing to balance because encouraging job growth through government policy is a good idea. But if you take a hard line in either direction, sometimes you don't get what you promise your constituents.
How about nationally? I know when the president was running, it was, we want jobs in America. We're going to put our American workers back together.
Well, I mean, you see the same logic. I mean, the idea is to somehow go after regulatory costs. And then President Trump and the Congress seems to argue for tax reform. So, I mean, just recently, you're seeing kind of these budget deals trying to reduce tax burdens as a way to spur kind of economic growth. So the dynamic scoring argument that if you were to reduce taxes, that would somehow kind of generate
the money free to do
exactly. You would
right.
generate additional economic development. And the Republicans have a really difficult time nationally because it's not clear how much they're willing to tolerate increases in debt as a way to kind of put through those tax cuts. And so the question is how to fund those tax cuts. It's kind of interesting that despite sharing partisan labels, there doesn't always seem to be a lot of consensus, even on fiscal issues, where you would imagine Republicans would be kind of more unified, particularly in the case of taxes.
So do you say the Republican Party have many different personalities within it?
Yes. I mean, so President Trump is very unique, right? Chief executive, and so it's not always the case that maybe he works as well with established kind of Republican politicians, and there are kind of factions within congressional Republicans that kind of lead to friction. I guess the question is whether or not congressional Republicans can kind of work with Trump on those issues where, like I said, I think you would imagine some consensus. Taxes would be one, and we just haven't seen that yet.
There's no motion or momentum.
Yeah, I mean, there's movement towards, I think, some kind of notion of reducing, right, tax burdens. We kind of heard that President Trump would like to, reduce the corporate income tax rate, from roughly 35% to 15%. And discussions about the viability of that and the cost, the fiscal cost.
Right, if we're going to get less money in, what are we going to do?
Exactly. So balancing those things is hard sometimes for anybody who's governing, let alone kind of Republicans who seem to be more open to tax reform.
Right. Now, these all international ramifications, trade and so forth. We've heard the talk about, looking at the trade balances and who we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, this is the root of economic job loss in the United States over time, right? Really what we're seeing is the United States losing a comparative advantage in sort of semi-skilled labor, and that comparative advantage moving to places like China for manufacture, India for many of our services, the East Asian tigers for electronics. And so as the United States loses a comparative advantage in those areas, companies will be able to produce goods cheaper in other countries. And that's regardless of taxation. I mean, I know there's this perception that the United States is a very high taxing country, but when you look at the European Union and some of the other OECD countries, it's just not true. They're lower taxes than those countries have, and all of these countries are dealing with this sort of shift in comparative advantage. And so what the United States really needs to understand is that technological innovation and comparative advantage in free trade is going to change the working relationship of what workers should be doing in the United States based on sort of this Ricardian idea of factors of endowment. And so really what we need to be doing is shifting worker education to things that are going to grow in the United States over the long run, which are really capital intensive projects. I mean, Apple, designed in California, made in China. And to build on Will's point, one of the reasons you don't see a lot of compromise or you don't see a lot of unity right now, even though the Republicans control the entire system, is because they come from different constituencies. And overlapping constituencies is a design built into the Constitution, which is literally designed to prevent one group from being able to control the whole thing. And so even though you have consolidated government, unified government, you're not going to get just everything going through as if this was a parliamentary sort of system. So
it forces that discussion. It forces that type of debate.
Well, yeah. I mean, it can also actually kind of restrict or otherwise stop changes or policies that maybe the public would maybe want from those various constituencies.
Right. So do you think people are starting to get impatient? I know it's been a year, well, it's not a year, but January, the president and everybody took over. It's been, since January. The voters, the people who voted, or the John Q. public, is there impatience starting yet, or are they saying, let's wait and see? What is the general feel?
Well, as Nick had mentioned, it kind of shows maybe some lack of knowledge about how institutions function, at least nationally, maybe also, at the state level. But the other issue is that the issues are hard. I mean, you're talking about immigration, which is something that we've been dealing with for a long time. You're talking about healthcare reform. So when issues are difficult, when it's hard to forge compromise, you would expect things to, I guess,
take longer to accomplish.
And presumably maybe also involve more significant compromises than the public initially thought were necessary. So, for example, dealing with border security. President Trump began when he was campaigning and won the presidency, talking about building.
First thing we're going to do is build a wall.
Right. And now you see President Trump kind of in some ways backpedaling and saying, okay, well, I want stronger border security, but we're going to delay the provision of the wall. Presumably because he has to seek compromise. He can't simply always or for that matter, any politician, just pursue their interests without working, with other officials.
So during an election cycle or campaign, the issues are presented in a simple method. All we have to do is do this.
Right.
Now, when you get there to make those decisions, it becomes tougher.
Right.
Yeah, all presidential candidates make bold promises. President Obama, when he was running, said, "I'm going to close down Gitmo," and he certainly wanted to do that. But when he gets in office, realizes that presidents don't have that unilateral authority. I think President Trump is realizing the same thing. Then he made his promise: "We're going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it."
Right.
And presidents don't have the authority to spend billions of tax dollars without congressional approval. And I think all presidential administrations run into this very same problem. And I think supporters get frustrated very quickly because things don't move as fast as they think they should, and because the general public's not really well informed about the role that the president plays in the American political system.
Well, and maybe to kind of go on with what Nicole's saying too, President Trump is also unique in the sense that he's not an elected politician. So, I mean, his business skills may work in a different context, but may not immediately translate into kind of political wins.
Understanding the political system.
And not to imply that he couldn't, it's just that his skill set is different, and so translating that into a very different sort of decision-making context makes it harder.
So he's had a learning curve himself.
Yeah, probably.
He has that
Presumably,
position,
yes.
probably.
Yes.
How do I
well,
make
you've seen administrative turnover, and you've seen shifts in his
people.
personnel. So I'm sure he's trying to figure out how best, to try to govern from the White House.
So learning in Washington as well.
Yeah.
What's going to make this work? So we talked about some of the issues and so forth. All of you teach in the classroom, of course, at Missouri Southern. I'm curious as far as the students or the younger generation. What are their reactions, or what do they talk about when people say, "Well, what's happening in politics?" What are you hearing among the
I
students?
think President Trump's been fantastic for student engagement.
Yes.
He caught their attention, a year before the election. Right, the celebrity apprentice guy is going to run for president. Right, caught their attention then, and for me, it hasn't let up. Students came in even this fall with questions, and sometimes you have to sort of push students to sort of pay attention to the news. The students are coming in now asking questions about DACA and these other programs that they've heard of on the news, right? It's filtering through their social media platforms, and they're consistently engaged in a way that I haven't seen prior to the Trump administration.
So there's a lot of benefits to the sometimes controversy that's arising.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same experience. I mean, I'm teaching globalization and development, which is a political economy class right now, and I taught this a few years ago, and the engagement a few years ago was nothing compared to what I'm getting now. It's like there's a resurgence in this discussion of international trade and where the United States' role is, and I think that even in the PSC 120, the American government class, students are coming in energized with questions. They're a lot more interested.
I mean, one of the issues that I've noticed that students are really interested in is the immigration. So, you were talking about DACA, but questions of, how do people get into the country? What can presidents in fact do to restrict immigration? What's their power? I mean, so we get into like the concepts and the ideas. But you're right. I mean, actually, just this afternoon in class, we were talking about DACA, and the class actually got a little bit unruly. I mean, they were
debating each
yes,
other.
yes. And so, I mean, and I had not seen that level. I mean, you call it engagement, but I haven't seen that in quite a while. So I think, President Trump has maybe made people more aware, possibly, of the consequences of politics, which helps, I think, us.
Helps
right,
you
in
in trying to teach
yeah,
in the classroom, right?
Absolutely,
Which is
yeah.
nice.
And we see more awareness. You mentioned social media. The students, where do they get their sources of information? Are they coming in and saying, "I saw it online," or are they saying, "I picked up the newspaper this morning"? How do they get?
I've never heard a student say they picked up a newspaper.
Unfortunately.
They are paying attention, and I think it's largely because they're getting more information through social media. And so I've had a number of students this semester already who've come in with stories and said, "Hey, I saw this on Facebook or something like that this morning. Is this true? Is this accurate?" And so it's always, "Well, send me the link. Let's pull it up." And it's really great for prompting a discussion of, this is how you check out a website to find out whether that news source is legitimate or whether it's an individual,
Just
hidden
posting
away in the
something, their
basement.
opinion.
Yeah. And so that's actually been great, because trying to convince students that it's important to take that next step to verify sources if it's some place that you're not familiar with, right? You can trust the Wall Street Journal to some extent all by itself, but when you get these other random websites, to make that extra 2 clicks makes a huge difference. And so for the sake of media literacy, it's actually been really great as well.
We've heard the term, quote, fake news quite a bit. Are students more aware that, is it real or is it fake?
Well, I mean, to Nicole's point, I mean, the idea is if you can interrogate the source and figure out kind of where the information is coming from, But it also, I mean, when you bring up fake news, I mean, it also brings up the potential problem of, so what isn't fake? So I mean, if the logic is fake news is everywhere, then the concern is that people are much more skeptical about traditional sources of news and information. So I mean, I've seen students kind of become maybe a little bit more careful in terms of the information that they use, or in class ask questions about where that information comes from, that sort of thing. So I've seen
Where's that source? They're trying to verify. Where did you hear that? Yeah.
I'm a bit more skeptical about the news environment at this time. I mean, one of the things we started to research, one of the things American politics and media people started to research was this thing called accidental exposure through social media. So you might not be an avid reader of news, but as you're searching through your news feed, you may see a title or something that your friend shared and click on it, right? And so you were accidentally exposed to political knowledge, and we thought that was going to be a really good thing. But now with the extent of fake news, people often don't click on the article and read the whole thing. One, they read the title and get their information from that. And two, there's a lot of misinformation going around, which at the end of the President Obama's administration, he tried to tackle what is true fake news. But I think the Trump administration has sort of framed this in a way where what we're getting now is both, this idea of selective exposure, where we only see news we want to see, but then also selective perception, where we believe things that if we were even a little bit, ready to do a little digging, would clearly be false. But we'd rather believe that because it fits with our preconceived notions. And I think that's becoming a bigger problem moving forward because, as Dr. Delahanty said, people now don't know what they can believe. And when you start to believe your only trusted source is the president, then how can you check the president?
Well, and actually to Dr. Nicoletti's point also, I mean, President Trump's use of Twitter, I mean, as a
daily
media, yes, I mean,
different.
It's incredible. I mean, it definitely allows him to speak directly to people that he otherwise wouldn't, and so it'll actually be kind of interesting to see if, I think presidents have been using it, but whether or not they would use it to the degree that President Trump has. People have kind of criticized his use of it. Some people have argued that it's to kind of connect with his base, but that kind of media communication, I think, will be really interesting kind of going forward.
So a lot of things potentially for you to follow up as political scientists in the future. And to talk about the media, the communication, I know just this past weekend they had some unrest in St. Louis and protests and so forth, but I understand that even the traditional media, TV and newspaper, were posting things on Facebook. Sure. And people were responding. There was a lot of community postings back and forth, negative, positive, whatever it might be. So are people sharing their thoughts more openly through things like social media and those Facebook postings, reacting to those posts they see?
I imagine, to some degree, you can kind of feel maybe more open with, kind of sharing. You also have a bigger community, I guess, that would, have access to the information. It's also less costly in terms of time and energy, I think, to gain access from those sources. So I think, it would make sense that people would maybe gravitate towards that, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily raise the quality of discussion,
of course not,
but it does make it easier for more people to engage and to share information.
So it kind of grows the community of discussion.
Yeah, absolutely, which can have some positive benefits.
So as you're looking at the future, we're a year or so out from the next cycle of elections, national, Congress. So what do you are there people positioning now for a year from now? I'm going to be on that ballot, or as we're seeing the issues being discussed.
Well, I mean, at the federal level, yes. I mean, so 2018 is going to be a very interesting year. I mean, the question is, so will Democrats make inroads into kind of the U.S. House? Right. Will they make inroads into the Senate? But you're already seeing kind of people building, if you will, war chests to kind of contest these elections. And actually, some of these elections are going to be incredibly expensive, kind of very high profile. So in the case of congressional elections, the timeline is a little bit shorter. But in the case of presidential elections, people are already starting to think about 2020 and contesting. President Trump is going to be the incumbent. So yes, everything is kind of well underway, at least at the federal level.
Statewide as well, you feel that people are looking ahead to next year and when we're going to be voting
Absolutely.
on people for the House?
It's actually, there's a little bit more predictability at the state level because legislators have term limits. Right. And so someone like Ron Richards, he's being term limited out. We know his seat becomes available. And so it's a little bit easier at the local level for people to start planning ahead, knowing when seats are going to open up. That being said, it doesn't get as much news coverage, and so it's a little bit more difficult for the general public to keep an eye on sort of who's jockeying for these positions. But yeah, it's absolutely part of the conversation. And there are a handful of interest groups in the state of Missouri that are particularly active in legislative politics.
When you say active, as far as financially active?
Yeah, financially active, raising a lot of money and playing a major role in the parties here in Missouri. And so they're active in recruiting and sort of laying out a game plan.
You mentioned both about the financial aspect. Is this something that you see going forward in the future, that it's going to cost a lot of money for elections and campaigns?
Absolutely. Claire McCaskill is going to be up for re-election. And some of the national pundits are saying this is probably going to be a huge marquee election for Missouri, probably going to break all records on expenditures for a Missouri Senate seat. And so with the advent of super PACs in 2010, and they're only about a few years old, 7 years old, we're going to see a ton of money spent there. Missouri is going to see a ton of outside money spent on this Senate race, more than just from within Missouri. And the really interesting thing here is you've got President Trump, who, if you follow the approval ratings, generally has some lower approval ratings. But you have way more Democratic senators up for re-election than Republican senators, and many of those seats are not as safe as you might think. So, Claire McCaskill's seat, she won because of Todd Akin, right? And if you remember, Todd Akin is, quote, legitimate rape person, right?
Opening his mouth and saying something, yeah.
Right.
She is vulnerable because this state is red, and so that's going to be a huge election for the Democrats, and we'll see if the Democrats can even keep it close in the Senate.
Well, it kind of suggests the Democrats are also going to be really careful about where they use their resources. They got to be very strategic. They're going to,
right.
So they're going to have key states where they're saying we're going to give a lot of money to this state and that state because they have a chance.
Yeah, you kind of have to be able to spend the money to kind of maintain those seats. Although, you would imagine they would spend maybe, well, I guess they would spend quite a bit on incumbents, but
yeah, because their likelihood of winning is higher.
Right. It's just, it'll be harder for them to invest in challengers then.
Yeah. So do you feel the Democratic Party is kind of reassessing things a year after that last election? They're going through a lot of just internal reflection.
Yeah, at the you've got kind of discussions at the very national level about leadership and kind of the direction of I think the Democratic Party. You've got maybe a leadership problem, which is, you don't really have, I don't think, a marquee individual or person
as the leader.
Right. Now, in the case of having a Democratic president, it makes it much easier because you look to the sitting president. But that leadership vacuum has to be filled, and the question may be who's going to fill it and why.
Yeah, I do think the National Democrats are doing a much better job of realizing and acknowledging the importance of state-level races, particularly after a census where we engage in redistricting. These redistricting races have an incredibly long impact, and Democrats have not done a good job in the last 30 years of paying attention to state-level races. They focus too much on the national level, and that's dug them a hole. There are some House seats that they could theoretically pick up this next season, but there are some seats, the way in which the district lines are drawn, there's
just not going to be in their favor.
They're going uphill. It's going to be a real challenge for them to pick up too many.
Well, I'd like to thank the three of you for visiting, sharing some information with our audience. I think it's great to have some reflection and from your perspective of what's happening around us in this world today.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. Hope you can join me again next week at the same time on this station. We'll see you then.